Airbus Albo will certainly be racking up the frequent flyer miles in the next few weeks. Today he arrived in Washington DC ahead of a state dinner with the US President Joe Biden, and then next week the Great Red Wall will come down. The Prime Minister will make a trip to China, which is obviously a major development after years of crippling tariffs on a number of industries. Well, joining me now is Shadow Minister for Trade and Tourism, Kevin Hogan. Kevin, welcome. The PM has promised a review of these trade tariffs on Australian wine during his meeting with President Xi. Barley tariffs were scrapped earlier this year. Wine still remains, and China seems open to moving on that. But you still have other tariffs as well on lobster and beef. How important is it for the Prime Minister to get moving on this stuff while he's in China?
Well, look, really important that we have movement on this, Caleb. I mean, to go back to the barley and the wine case that you just mentioned, so these were, we believe, illegal and punitive tariffs put on our goods by China. We, when we were in government, started the appeal process through the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization, we believe, is about to make its ruling on the wine tariff that they've put on us. Now, we believe that the World Trade Organization will find in our favour. So, look, in that case, I do support the government by suspending the WTO process. Let China do their internal review to get access back for our wine. Very important, $1 billion a year those wine exports were worth to us, so we want them back. And as you quite rightly point out, still have lobsters and crayfish that don't have access from another reason they're not importing it. And there's beef exporters the same still.
Well, just take a look at this. This is Albanese yesterday talking about the importance of this trip to stabilise relations.
This will be an important visit. It is important that we stabilise our relationship with China. That is in the interests of Australia and China, and it is indeed in the interests of the world that we have stable relations, and that is what this visit will represent. A win-win. Australia gets to export our wine. Importantly, China gets to receive this amazing product.
Now, look, I agree. Stable relations are a good thing. China is a major trading partner and we ought to have a reasonable relationship with them. But forgive me for being cynical here. You know, in the last couple of weeks, we saw, of course, the return of Cheng Lei, so that was a win for Australia. Now we're talking about wine tariffs coming off, so that's a win for Australia. But then very quietly on Friday, the Prime Minister releases a 4-month-old report into the port of Darwin and says that it will remain in Chinese hands. Relations, good relations are fine. We ought to have them. But at what point in this give and take do we end up, and I think this is the case with the Port of Darwin, do we end up ceding too much ground to China and allowing them to continue to have control on a major strategic asset, which they really shouldn't have, should still be in Australian hands, in the hopes that we can get something better out of them elsewhere, like wine or the return of Cheng Lei? Like, are we really that much better off by ceding these things to them?
Well, look, you raise a good point, Caleb, and to go wider than the Port of Darwin, I mean, I think the Chinese have been asking us that we have the Foreign Investment Review Board, which will review and have a look at any foreign investment that's been made in this country, whether it's in the national interest that happen. And I know the Chinese obviously want us to review that and look at that because they think that's too strict. But, you know, I think that we need to be very careful with this because let's not forget either, Caleb, these tariffs that were put on both barley and wine were illegal. I think China have toned down what was called the wolf warrior diplomacy. They were trying, I believe, to use trade coercively. And this isn't just an Australia-China thing. This has been a China and many other country issue where China have used trade, I think, coercively to try and make a point. So, look, I think in the upside of this, Caleb, I think the WTO process has worked. I think the fact that China reviewed both of these, and we hope, and it's good for our wine exporters for this to be dropped, I think the WTO process has worked, which has been a good thing.
You know, I've been banging on about this for for quite a while, but when all these trade sanctions were put upon us in Australia, the countries that benefited the most out of it were the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, because their exports of the products that we couldn't export anymore went through the roof. And I'm not sure that they've ever quite acknowledged that to us. But speaking of which, you've got Albanese going over to the US, or he's in the US now, to meet with US President Joe Biden on a state visit, and you'll have, AUKUS, Israel, Ukraine will all be the main areas of discussion. And Albanese is also set to urge Biden to remain focused on the Indo-Pacific region as a counterbalance to China. Here's Albo talking about the importance of our relationship with the US.
The United States relationship with Australia is our most important. The first pillar, of course, is our defence relationship, making sure that the AUKUS arrangements are put in place and talking with Congress and Senate about the legislation that's required to turn this vision into a practical reality. It will be a very important visit that comes at a turbulent time for the world. But the good thing about Australia and the United States is the strength of the relationship means it provides that stability, that security, and that comfort with each other that comes from our common values.
I mean, this kind of debt diplomacy that China carries out through the Pacific region, we as a nation on our own don't have the kind of money to counter that. It relies on the help of countries like the UK and the US, and it's important for them to get involved in this sort of tug of war in terms of power in the Pacific region, because if you let China have too much power here, that has ongoing ramifications for the rest of the West, right?
Look, absolutely, Caleb. And look, two things we did as a previous government as well. When you look at AUKUS, obviously initiated by the previous government, and let's not forget the Quad, which is the arrangement obviously between India, Australia and Japan and the US. So that's a very important relationship as well. So national security is the most important thing any government can do. Both those initiatives initiated by us as a previous government. So important, great counterbalance obviously for geopolitical tensions rising in the region for the reasons that you've just mentioned. But then to flip it back though to Caleb, while national security is important, AUKUS and the Quad really important. Trade on the other side, even when our situation with China, with government-to-government relations wasn't the best, the fact that we still have this trading relationship and there's people-to-people and business-to-business relationships is a positive thing. And I think that's helped too through the WTO as well to mean that we've had some results there from China stepping back from some of this wolf warrior diplomacy.
Just moving on to a separate issue for a moment, Kevin. The peak body behind the No campaign for the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, Advance Australia, they're obviously moving on from that now. That's all done. But their next target is going to be Labor's misinformation laws, because they're claiming that it'll be used as an attempt to silence conservative voices. I mean, I think it goes further than that. It's not just about censoring conservative voices. It's about censoring anyone at any time that they feel the need to, whether they be a conservative or otherwise. If you say something that the government decides is outside of the realms of what it likes, and that could be any government, mind you, it could be a coalition government or it could be a Labor government. Whoever's in power has the ability to control this kind of thing. If we set that precedent with a government-owned body or controlled body like ACMA to be able to tell you what you can and can't say on social media, I mean, we go down a very dark road.
Look, this comes back to one of the greatest things we have in our community and our country is freedom of speech. And this legislation, with no exaggeration, is threatening that. And to go back to the No campaign or to the referendum you just mentioned, you would have seen the Prime Minister that night when he gave his media, when he answered questions from the media that Saturday night, he actually had a bit of a spray at the media that night. And he said, he blamed some people in the room for basically spreading misinformation from the No campaign campaign. Now, what was that misinformation? He alluded to then that the misinformation that it was making, some of the accusations being made by the No campaign was stupid, like, the power of the voice. They weren't stupid claims. People were questioning the power of the voice because we knew that it was the High Court that would determine the power of the voice, not federal parliament if it was in the Constitution. Now, he poo-pooed it that night and had to go at the media when he lost his referendum. So that is why this legislation is so dangerous, because as you alluded to, there will be some bureaucrat or the government sitting there somewhere saying that's misinformation and that's not allowed. And there goes freedom of speech. And we're back to George Orwell and the Ministry of the Truth with that type of stuff, because there'll be one person determining what truth is and what truth isn't.
Kevin Hogan, thank you for joining me.